Hello, math students. Today we are going to talk about putting fractions in order, comparing them, seeing which one is bigger and which one is smaller. So we are going to take a look at in our textbook, page 67, and we just have a couple of practice problems for today. So the first one, we're going to look at number 5 and then number 6 for today and thinking about which fraction is bigger, which one is smaller. So the first one for number 5, we have 2 circles. And you'll notice that this first circle is split into 4 equal parts and one of those parts is shaded. So this would be 1/4 or 1/4 of the circle is shaded. And over here, this one, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we have one part that's shaded out of 5. So this one would be 1/5. So we're thinking about which is greater. And when they say which is greater, they mean which part, which fraction of the circle, which part of the circle is bigger. Is this part, this kind of chunk of the circle bigger, or is this chunk of the circle bigger? And we can kind of see here that it looks like this chunk is bigger than this chunk. Because if you split something into 4 equal parts, one of those parts is going to be bigger than if you split it into 5 chunks. That little chunk is going to be smaller. So if we wanted to write that using our less than, greater than, or equal to symbols, we could write 1/4 is greater than 1/5. And if it helps you to draw the little teeth, remember the little Pac-Man alligator guy, he wants to eat the bigger number. And the bigger fraction is going to be 1/4. The smaller fraction is 1/5. Now, one way you might want to remember that is it's sort of the opposite. So we learned the other day about what the numbers are called. The number at the top is called the numerator. The number at the bottom is the denominator. So when we have a 1 in the numerator, when we're just talking about one chunk, if you look at the denominator that is bigger is actually a smaller fraction. So it's sort of like opposites. You would think, well, I see a 4 here and a 5 here, 5 is bigger. Well, in fractions, it is the opposite. When the denominator gets bigger, the fraction is actually smaller. So that's kind of interesting. So 1/4 is greater than, it's bigger than 1/5. All right, let's try another one. Number 6 says, arrange the fractions in order, begin with the smallest. And then they've just given us some fractions in these little boxes, 1/2, 1/8, and 1/5. So what you might want to do here is draw a little picture. I know it always helps me to draw pictures. So we are comparing 1/2, and I'm just going to draw 3 rectangles. And then I'm going to draw what does 1/2 look like, because they want me to think about, let's see, we're going to try to put these in order from the smallest to the biggest. So 1/2, I split it into 2 parts and I color in one of the parts. This is 1/2. The next one is 1/8. Ooh. Now this one, what I like to do I like to kind of keep dividing. So what I did there is I first split it into half, and then I split it into fourths, and then I split it into eighths. So if you wanted to see that one more time, I'll show you one more time. So I split it in half. Then I draw a line in between each chunk, and now it's split into fourths. And now if I draw a line in each chunk, I can draw it into eighths, like that. So kind of a nifty little trick here. So let's make sure that Miss Taylor has 1/8. So here's one part out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is 1/8. Ooh, look at how tiny that little chunk is. And then the other one they want us to compare is 1/5. So 1/5 would look something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll shade in that chunk. And then I can see, because I've tried to use the same shape, a rectangle, so I can see 1/2 would be that much, 1/8 would be that much, and 1/5 would look a bit like that. So they want us to order them and beginning with the smallest. Well, we can see that the smallest chunk actually has the biggest denominator. So see how that's kind of the opposite. The biggest denominator is actually the smallest fraction. Sort of makes sense if you think about it. If we're splitting something up into 8 chunks and we're only coloring one of those parts, that little part is going to be pretty small. So if you had some kind of a delicious little cake that you were sharing with some friends, and your friend said, "Ooh, would you like 1/2 of the cake, 1/8 of the cake, or 1/5 of the cake?" Well, I guess it depends on how hungry you are. But if you were really hungry, you might say, "Oh, I think I'd prefer 1/2." Or if you were not very hungry at all, you could say, "Well, maybe just 1/8. I'm not too hungry." All right. So again, that denominator, when that gets bigger, the actual fraction is smaller. So 1/8 is going to be the smallest. So I'm just going to write here, this is the smallest, is 1/8. Then the next smallest would be 1/5. And we can see 1/5 is smaller than 1/2. So next would be 1/5. And then the biggest fraction is 1/2. This is the biggest or the greatest fraction. Okay. So if we wanted to use less than and greater than symbols, we could also do that. We could erase our commas here. And let's see, we could say 1/8 is smaller than 1/5. We're just looking at these two. 1/5 is bigger. And then if we're kind of looking at these two, well, I know 1/2 is bigger. So that would look like this. So this is the smallest to the biggest. And this will work with any shape. You could also do circles or squares. I find rectangles to be helpful with this. Now, if you were in school, I would have you all coloring some fraction bars. And let me show you what they would look like. So, again, I know we're not in school right now, but to help us, I would give you some fraction bars or fraction strips to help with this concept. And that way, so they have a bunch of rectangles here. And usually what I do is I have students color in one hole, and you can kind of pick any color. And then I try to ask students to leave one of the other chunks blank so that we can see and we can compare the fractions. So this one's kind of hard to tell because I colored it black, but there are 12 of these little chunks. And so this is 1/12. Look at how small that is. 1/10 is a little bit bigger. 1/8 would look like that. Ooh, and the ones we were just comparing on our whiteboard here, remember we did 1/5 and 1/8. So here's 1/8, and here is 1/5. So you can kind of see the difference. There's 1/6, 1/5, 1/4 or 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, and there is a whole. So if it helps you, you could definitely draw something like this to help you. You could cut out little pieces of paper that might kind of help you with this. I wanted to show you one other thing. We have some fraction circles. And again, kind of the same idea, but a different shape. So here are some fraction circles. And again, just to help us to see, ooh, look at how big this chunk that is 1/2. This is a pretty big fraction, a pretty big chunk. 1/3 would look, oops, I guess I was doing the blank side, the blank part here. 1/3 is a little smaller. 1/5, or 1/4, excuse me, 1/5, 1/6, 1/8. So you see they're getting smaller and smaller if we're just talking about one of those parts. Okay. So your homework for today, your homework is actually to draw some fraction bars or some fraction strips. So kind of just like I showed you, if you wanted to use some color to draw these, you definitely could. Or you can just use your pencil. It says color one part of each bar to show the given fraction. So they've done the first one for you. They've colored in 1/2. So you're just going to color in 1 out of 2 equal parts. The next one is 1/3. So you're going to color in 1 part out of 3 equal parts. 1/4. You're just going to color in 1. 1/5. Color in 1 part out of 5. And just like that. And then you'll be able to see on your own paper how tiny 1/12 is. It's a very, very tiny little fraction. All right, then we're going to do a little bit of less than, greater than to find out which fraction is bigger or smaller. It says use the fraction bars above to help you. So after we've colored in, and I'm going to look at my fraction bars that I've already colored, 1/2 and 1/3. So if we look back here, here's 1/2 and here's 1/3. And I can see 1/2 is bigger than 1/3. So here, 1/2, I'm going to put the open mouth wants to eat the bigger one. So 1/2 is bigger. All right. What about down here? It says what about 1/8 and 1/2? So I can look back here at my people. Well, 1/8 is pretty tiny and 1/2 is pretty big. Remember, it's kind of like the opposite. Look at the denominator. It's an 8. It's a bigger number. It's actually a smaller fraction. So the Pac-Man alligator monster guy wants to eat the bigger one. It's going to eat 1/2. All right. On this page, you will notice that there's a couple different things that we're working on. Circle the greater fraction, and that's the bigger one. And then down here it says circle the smaller fraction. But you'll notice that there are not any pictures here. What might be a prudent idea? Did you say draw a picture? Excellent. You might want to draw a picture of what would 1/9 look like? What would 1/12 look like? And these don't have to be beautiful drawings. It could just be a little sketch. I like to sketch rectangles. That kind of helps me. But you could do any shape here. They've given you a couple examples here. You do not need to draw a picture, but it might help you. You could also think about, well, I'm going to look at 1/10 and 1/8, and they want to know which one is bigger. And I remember Miss Taylor said it's sort of opposite. So this one has a bigger denominator. The fraction is actually the smaller denominator. You could circle that. You could also look back at your fraction bars and think about, well, here I colored in 1/10. Here I colored in 1/8. Ooh, 1/8 is bigger. Down here, you're going to do a similar thing, but this time you're going to circle the smaller fraction. So be careful. The smaller fraction is, let's see, we have 1/4 and 1/6. So we would color in 1/6 is going to be the smaller one. All right, so let's see. And we have one more page. And again, please just try to pay attention to the directions because we're doing a couple different things here. This is circle the greatest fraction. That means the biggest. And this one says circle the smallest fraction. So it might help you to think about how we talked about how they're sort of opposites. So the greatest fraction is actually going to have the smaller denominator. So 1/2 is going to be the greatest. All right. And then down here we have arranged the fractions in order beginning with the smallest. So they've given you some fractions here on little flags and they want you to begin with the smallest fraction. And we know the smallest actually has the biggest denominator. It's right here. So 1/10, I'm going to write right here. 1/10 is the smallest. And I can flip back to my fraction bar to help me. 1/10 is a pretty tiny little fraction. So I would write 1/10. The next smallest would be 1/8, which is right here. I'm just going to write it here. The next smallest would be 1/4. And then the biggest is 1/2. All right. And then this is a very similar problem, but it says arrange the fractions in order beginning with the greatest. So now you're going to begin with the biggest one. And the biggest fraction, let me see here. Let me flip back. Well, the biggest fraction that we've been talking about is 1/2. But I don't see any 1/2s here. But I do see one that's pretty close. I think I see this 1/3. That's a pretty big fraction. That would be, all of this is 1/3. So here, the biggest fraction would be 1/3. So you're going to start with 1/3. All right. So that is your homework for today. Have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.